It was nearly midnight when the office went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes with emptiness, but the charged quiet of a space holding its breath. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar electric lullaby, casting everything in that pale, institutional glow that makes even the most mundane moments feel suspended in time. I could hear the distant whir of computers still running their overnight processes, the soft tick of the wall clock that somehow sounded louder in the stillness. And beneath it all, the faint smell of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I should have left by then. Should have gathered my things, switched off my monitor, and walked out into the real world where normal people were sleeping in their beds or finishing late dinners with people they loved. Instead, I sat at my desk, fingers hovering over a keyboard I was no longer really using, pretending to review quarterly reports that could have waited until morning. But I knew why I was still there. The same reason I've been staying late for weeks now, long after my official duties were done. Dorian was still here. I could feel his presence 3 offices down, behind his closed door with the frosted glass that showed only shadows and light. Even when I couldn't see him, I knew exactly how he sat at his desk. Shoulders squared, sleeves rolled up just enough to show the edges of forearms that were surprisingly strong for a man who spent his days moving numbers around spreadsheets instead of moving through the world. His dark hair would be slightly disheveled by now, pushed back by fingers that ran through it when he was thinking, though he'd never let anyone see him anything less than perfectly composed during business hours. That was the thing about Dorian Hayes. During the day, he was untouchable. Sharp suits, sharper words, the kind of quiet authority that made junior associates let me stumble over their own sentences just try to keep up. He had a reputation for being ruthless in meetings, for cutting through excuses and half-formed ideas with surgical precision. People called him demanding, unforgiving. Some used less charitable words when they thought he couldn't hear them. But late at night, when the building emptied and the corporate mask started to slip, I had begun to see something else. Something that made my chest tighten in ways I didn't quite know how to name. The sound of a coffee mug hitting would cut through my thoughts like a gunshot. Sharp, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I looked up from my screen to see Dorian standing in his office doorway, framed by the warm light spilling out behind him. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar now, tie loosened, and there was something different in his posture. Less rigid, more dangerous. Our eyes met across the empty workspace, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt electric, charged with all the things we had been carefully not saying for months. All the lingering glances during presentations, the way his hand would brush mine when he handed me files, the conversations that started about work and somehow drifted into territory that felt far too personal for the fluorescent-lit confines of our professional world. Then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the silence, low and deliberate in a way that made something twist deep in my stomach. "Stay after hours if you want me." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to unsee or unhear. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there, frozen, while my mind scrambled to process what had just happened. Was it a command? The kind of sharp directive he was famous for during the day? Was it some kind of test, another way to measure whether I had what it took to survive in his demanding world? Or was it something else entirely? I watched as he leaned back against his door frame, arms crossed, and there was something in his expression I had never seen before. Not the polished professionalism he wore like armor during meetings. Not the distant courtesy he showed to colleagues and clients. This was raw and unguarded, like seeing him without his suit jacket for the first time. His dark eyes held mine with an intensity that made my skin feel too tight, and at the corners of his mouth was the faintest suggestion of a smirk. Not cruel, not mocking, something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. When Dorian leaned back in his chair, his gaze never wavering from mine, I understood with startling clarity that this was none of the things I had first thought. Not a command, not a joke, not even really a confession, though it felt like one. It was an invitation, and the terrifying thing, the thing that made my hands shake as I reached for my water bottle just to have something to do with them, was that I couldn't tell if I was more afraid of leaving or staying. Because leaving meant pretending this moment had never happened. It meant going back to careful professional distance and conversations that never strayed beyond quarterly projections and client presentations. It meant acting like I hadn't noticed the way he looked at me sometimes, like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve, or the way my pulse quickened every time he said my name. But staying meant acknowledging something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. It meant admitting that all those late nights weren't really about work at all, that the extra hours I'd been putting in had nothing to do with career ambition and everything to do with the way the office felt different when it was just us. Smaller, more intimate, like we're the only two people in the world. The fluorescent light above my desk flickered once, twice, then steadied. In that brief interruption of illumination, something shifted. When the light came back, Dorian was still watching me, still wearing that expression that was part challenge, part invitation, part something I couldn't quite name. I realized my breathing had gone shallow, and I forced myself to take a deeper breath, to think clearly through the fog of confusion and want that seemed to have settled over my brain like a blanket. 23 years old, fresh out of college, and I thought I had known what I wanted from this job. A foot in the door. Experience. A chance to prove myself in the corporate world. I had never planned on this. On him. On the way he could look at me across a conference room and make me forget what I was supposed to be saying, or the way his rare smiles felt like personal victories I wanted to collect and keep safe somewhere private. The clock on the wall ticked another minute past midnight. Outside, the city continued its restless motion, but inside this building, inside this moment, everything felt suspended. Waiting, Dorian straightened slightly, and I thought he might say something else. Clarify what he meant. Give me some kind of roadmap for navigating whatever this was becoming. Instead, he simply turned and walked back into his office, leaving the door open behind him like a question mark hanging in the fluorescent-lit air. And I sat there, staring at that open door, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. I suppose I should explain how I ended up here, sitting in an empty office at midnight, watching my boss disappear into his doorway like some kind of beautiful, dangerous invitation I wasn't sure I was brave enough to accept. My name is Nathaniel Chun, and 6 months ago, I was nobody, fresh out of Columbia with a business degree that felt more like an expensive piece of paper than actual preparation for the real world. 23 years old and drowning in student loans, desperate for any kind of foothold in Manhattan's unforgiving corporate landscape. When the offer came through for a junior analyst position at Hayes & Associates, I didn't even negotiate the salary. I just said yes and tried not to sound as grateful as I felt. The first time I saw Dorian Hayes, he was ending someone's career. I had been in the office exactly 3 days when I witnessed him systematically dismantle a senior associate's presentation in the main conference room. Not with cruelty, exactly, but with a precision that was somehow worse. Every flaw exposed, every weak argument laid bare, until the man gathering his papers looked like he'd been filleted by an expert. The rest of us sat in silence, watching Dorian straighten his cufflinks as if he'd just finished discussing the weather. That should have terrified me. Instead, I found myself fascinated by the controlled way he moved through the world, like every gesture had been measured and found perfectly adequate. His suits were impeccable, but never flashy. His hair was always exactly in place. Even his handwriting, which I glimpsed when he signed documents, was precise and unforgiving. Dorian was 34, 11 years older than me, and carried himself like someone who had never questioned whether he belonged in any room he entered. Where I stumbled over words and second-guessed every email before sending it, he spoke with the kind of quiet authority that made people lean forward to catch every syllable. His reputation in the office was legendary. Ruthless in negotiations. Brilliant with numbers. The kind of man who could spot a discrepancy in a 100-page financial report within minutes of opening it. But that was only part of the story. In those first few weeks, I made it my mission to be invisible. I arrived early, stayed late, said yes to every assignment no matter how tedious. I brought coffee to meetings without being asked, proofread documents until my eyes burned, and never complained even when I was handed tasks that were clearly beneath my education level. I was determined to prove myself, to show that hiring me hadn't been a mistake. It was during one of those late nights, maybe a month into the job, that I first glimpsed something else beneath Dorian's polished exterior. I had been working on a client presentation until well past 9 when I heard quiet laughter coming from his office. Not the sharp, professional chuckle he used in meetings, but something warmer, more human. When I looked up, I saw him on a phone call, feet propped up on his desk, tie loosened for the first time since I'd known him. He was talking to someone, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, and there was a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that transformed his entire face. For just a moment, he looked like someone I might want to know outside of these sterile office walls. That was when our eyes met through his glass door, and the smile faded back into professional distance. He ended his call quickly, straightened his tie, and became the untouchable Dorian Hayes again. But I had seen beneath the surface, just for an instant, and something about that glimpse lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest and refused to let go. After that, I started noticing things. The way he would pause slightly when handing me files, his fingers brushing mine for just a fraction longer than necessary. How he would sometimes look up from his work when I passed his office, not with the perfunctory acknowledgement he gave others, but with something that felt like genuine interest. During team meetings, I caught him watching me more than once, his dark eyes unreadable but intent, like he was trying to solve some complicated equation in his head. We developed a strange rhythm. During the day, everything was strictly professional. He would critique my work with the same surgical precision he applied to everyone else, assign me projects with crisp efficiency, and maintain exactly the right distance between boss and subordinate. But as the office emptied in the evenings, something would shift. The walls between us would become more permeable. He started staying later too. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but I knew. I could feel him there, 3 offices down, working through documents that could have waited until morning. Sometimes, when I was the last one left in the main workspace, he would emerge from his office for coffee or to use the printer, and we would find ourselves in the break room together, surrounded by the quiet hum of vending machines and the distant sound of cleaning crews working on other floors. Those moments were charged with something neither of us was willing to name. Conversations that started about quarterly projections, but somehow drifted into observations about the city outside our windows, or books we'd read, or places we traveled. His voice would lose some of its professional edge, and I would catch glimpses of dry humor, of thoughtfulness that he kept carefully hidden during business hours. Sometimes, when he was explaining a complex financial concept, he would stand closer than strictly necessary, close enough that I could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. Once, when I was struggling with a particularly difficult analysis, he leaned over my shoulder to point at something on my screen, and his breath against my ear made every rational thought disappear for several long seconds. We never acknowledged these moments. Never spoke about the way the air seemed to thicken when we were alone together, or the way conversations would trail off into loaded silences that neither of us seemed willing to break. Until tonight, until the coffee mug slammed against wood and Dorian Hayes finally said the thing we had both been thinking but were too careful, too professional, too afraid to voice. Stay after hours if you want me. The next morning arrived with all the brutal efficiency of fluorescent lights flickering on at exactly 8 a.m. I sat at my desk, staring at quarterly reports that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. Try to convince myself that the previous night had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination, that I had imagined the weight in Dorian's voice when he spoke those words, the way his eyes had held mine like he was offering me something precious and dangerous at the same time. But when he walked past my desk at 9:15, coffee in hand, wearing that same perfectly pressed navy suit he'd worn a dozen times before, everything about his posture screamed professional distance. He nodded at me the way he nodded at everyone else. Polite, appropriate, completely removed from the man who had leaned against his doorframe at midnight and shattered every carefully maintained boundary between us. He gave me assignments like nothing had changed, critiqued my work with the same surgical precision he always used, carried himself through meetings and phone calls as if the moment in his office had never existed at all. By noon, I was starting to wonder if I had lost my mind entirely, but I felt it in the spaces between his words, in the way he paused just a fraction too long when handing me documents, In the careful way he avoided looking directly at me during the team meeting, as if eye contact might give something away that neither of us was ready to acknowledge in daylight. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Every time my phone buzzed with an email from him, my pulse would spike, then settle back into disappointment when it was just work. Budget revisions, client feedback, the same mundane corporate communication that had filled my inbox for months. By 5:30, the office began its familiar evening migration. Jackets retrieved from chairbacks, computers shut down with decisive clicks, conversations about weekend plans floating through the air like small talk confetti. I watched my colleagues file toward the elevators, heading home to their real lives, while I sat frozen at my desk, pretending to be absorbed in a spreadsheet that could have been completed hours ago. The truth was, I didn't know how to leave. Didn't know if walking out that door would be the smart, professional thing to do, or if it would be running away from something that might never be offered again. By 7, the office was nearly empty. Just the usual suspects who always stayed late. Marcus from accounting, who had 3 kids and preferred the quiet office to his chaotic house. Jennifer from marketing, who was working on a campaign that had consumed her life for the past month. And me, still sitting at my desk like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. At 8, Marcus packed up and left. At 8:30, Jennifer gathered her things and headed for the elevator, calling out a distracted goodbye that echoed in the increasingly empty space. And then it was just us. I could hear him moving around in his office. The soft sound of papers being shuffled, the quiet click of his keyboard, the distant hum of his desk lamp. Normal sounds that somehow felt loaded with meaning in the silence that had settled over the building like a blanket. At 9:15, I heard his office door open. I didn't look up from my screen, but I could feel him moving through the workspace, could track his progress by the soft sound of his footsteps on the carpet. He stopped at the copy machine for several minutes. The mechanical whir and beep of the device the only sound in the empty office. Then more footsteps heading toward the break room. I forced myself to keep staring at my computer screen, even though the numbers had stopped making sense hours ago. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it from across the room. When he emerged from the break room 5 minutes later, he didn't go directly back to his office. Instead, his footsteps moved closer until I could sense him standing somewhere behind my chair. Still here? His voice was soft, almost casual, but there was something underneath it that made my skin prickle with awareness. I swallowed hard before answering. Yeah, a pause that stretched between us like a hell breath. I could feel him behind me, could imagine the way he was probably standing with his hands in his pockets, head tilted slightly as he studied me. When he spoke again, his voice carried that same dangerous undertone from the night before. Guess you want something after hours. This time, I did turn around. He was standing about 3 feet away, leaning against the edge of another desk. And there was that smirk again. Not mocking, not cruel, but something far more complex. Something that looked like challenge and invitation rolled into one expression that made my mouth go dry. It wasn't a command this time. I could hear the difference in his tone, could see it in the relaxed way he held himself. This was a test, but not the kind I was used to from him. Not a professional evaluation of my competence or dedication. This was something else entirely. A question wrapped in a statement, an offer disguised as an observation. He was giving me a choice, letting me decide whether to acknowledge what had been building between us in all those late-night moments, or whether to pretend this was all just coincidence. I realized I had been holding my breath, and I forced myself to exhale slowly, trying to think past the way he was looking at me. Like he could see straight through all the professional distance I'd been trying to maintain, right down to the part of me that had been staying late for weeks now, not because of work, but because of him. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, casting everything in that familiar pale glow that made even the most ordinary moments feel suspended in time. Somewhere in the distance, a phone was ringing in an empty office, but neither of us moved to answer it. I looked at him standing there, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up just enough to show the edges of those surprisingly strong forearms, and I realized with startling clarity that I didn't want to leave. Hadn't wanted to leave for weeks now. The realization should have terrified me. Should have sent me reaching for my jacket and my keys and all the safe professional distance I had been clinging to like armor. Instead, it felt like finally admitting something I had been trying not to know about myself. We fell into a rhythm after that night, though calling it a rhythm makes it sound more natural than it was. During the day, we maintained the same careful professional distance we always had. Dorian would assign me projects with his usual crisp efficiency, critique my work with surgical precision, and carry himself through meetings like the untouchable executive everyone knew him to be. I would respond with the same eager professionalism I had cultivated since my first day, nodding at his feedback, asking the right questions, keeping my voice steady even when his fingers brushed mine while passing documents. But when the office emptied and the fluorescent lights took on that different quality they had after hours, something would shift between us. The air would become charged with possibility, and those carefully maintained boundaries would start to feel more like theater than necessity. He began staying later more regularly. Not obviously, never in a way that would draw attention from our colleagues, but I knew. I could feel him there in his office, working through reports and correspondence that could easily have waited until morning. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of him through his glass door, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly mussed from running his fingers through it, and he would look up at exactly the moment I was watching, like he had some kind of internal radar for my attention. Those moments when our eyes met felt like small electric shocks, brief but undeniable, leaving me with the feeling that something important had just passed between us, even if I couldn't name what it was. The break room became our unofficial meeting ground. He would emerge from his office around 9 or 10, ostensibly to get coffee or retrieve something from the printer, and somehow I would find myself there at the same time, as if we were both following some invisible choreography we had never discussed. We would stand by the coffee machine or the copy area, surrounded by the quiet hum of office equipment, and have conversations that started about work but invariably drifted somewhere more personal. He told me about a book he was reading, a biography of some long-dead industrialist that he found surprisingly engaging. I mentioned a documentary I had watched about urban planning, and he listened with the same focused attention he brought to client presentations. These weren't the kinds of conversations I had with other colleagues, quick exchanges about weekend plans or complaints about the weather. These felt deeper, more deliberate, like we were both testing the waters of something that existed outside the professional realm entirely. Sometimes, when he was explaining a particularly complex financial concept, he would move closer than strictly necessary, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that seemed to linger in the air even after he had moved away. Once, when I was struggling with a client analysis that had been giving me trouble for hours, he appeared behind my desk without warning, leaning over my shoulder to point at something on my screen. His breath was warm against my ear when he spoke, his voice lower than usual as he walked me through the problem. I found myself concentrating more on the heat radiating from his body than on the numbers he was showing me. And when he straightened up, there was a moment of loaded silence where neither of us moved. I could feel him looking down at me, could sense something unspoken hanging in the air between us, but when I finally turned around, he had already stepped back to a more appropriate distance. But there was something theatrical about the way he critiqued my work now, as if the sharpness in his voice was a performance designed to mask something else entirely. He would tear apart a report I had spent days on with his usual precision, but I began to notice the way his eyes would soften slightly when he handed it back to me, or how he would find reasons to call me into his office for follow-up discussions that felt more like conversations than corrections. One evening, when we were alone in the break room again, he was standing closer than usual, close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes and the way his jaw tensed slightly when he was thinking. I had been talking about something inconsequential, some observation about the city outside our windows, when I realized he wasn't really listening to my words. He was watching my mouth as I spoke, with an intensity that made my voice trail off mid-sentence. The silence that followed felt heavy with possibility. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the way my breathing had gone shallow under his gaze. For a moment, it felt like he might say something or do something that would shatter the careful pretense we had been maintaining. Instead, he took a step back and asked if I wanted more coffee, his voice carefully neutral. But the moment stayed with me, replaying in my head during meetings and phone calls and all the mundane tasks that filled my days. I found myself analyzing every interaction, looking for signs that I hadn't imagined the charge in the air between us, the way he seemed to be studying me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It was during one of those late nights, maybe 3 weeks after our first after-hours encounter, that I finally worked up the courage to acknowledge what was happening. We were standing by the windows that looked out over the city, both of us holding coffee cups we weren't really drinking, and the silence between us felt particularly loaded. "You scare me sometimes," I said quietly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He turned to look at me, and for a moment his professional mask slipped entirely. His expression was softer than I had ever seen it, almost vulnerable, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual authority. "Good," he said. "Then you're paying attention." It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't mockery. It was control, yes, but underneath, it was something that looked remarkably like desire. Raw and unguarded and directed entirely at me. And I realized, standing there in the fluorescent-lit break room with the city spreading out below us like a carpet of lights, that I wasn't afraid of his control at all. I was afraid of how much I wanted to surrender to it. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in October, when the first real chill of autumn had settled over the city and the office felt even more isolated from the outside world than usual. I had been staying late again, ostensibly working on a client presentation that was due the following week, but really just waiting for the office to empty, for that familiar shift in atmosphere that happened when it was just us, for whatever moment might come next in this strange dance we had been performing for weeks. Dorian had been in meetings most of the day, the kind of high-stakes negotiations that kept his door closed and his phone constantly ringing. I had caught glimpses of him through his glass walls, pacing while he talked, running his hands through his hair in a way that suggested the conversations weren't going smoothly. By 8 o'clock, when the last of our colleagues had finally departed, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man trying to maintain control over something that was threatening to slip away. At 9:30, he emerged from his office and walked directly to where I was sitting, no pretense of getting coffee or using the printer. He stopped a few feet from my desk, hands in his pockets, and there was something different in his expression. Less careful, more raw. We stayed like that for several long moments, looking at each other across the space that had somehow become charged with months of unspoken tension. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, and somewhere in the building a heating system kicked on with a distant mechanical sigh, but neither of us spoke. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. The careful distance, the professional pretense, the way we kept dancing around something that felt increasingly inevitable. I saved my work, closed my laptop, and looked up at him with what I hoped was more courage than I actually felt. "What do you want from me?" The words came out quieter than I had intended, but they carried clearly in the silence. For a moment, he didn't respond. His dark eyes studied my face with an intensity that made my skin feel too tight, like he was trying to read something written there that I wasn't even sure I knew how to write. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, like the question had caught him off guard despite the fact that we had been building toward it for weeks. "If I said everything, would you stay?" The honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. Not everything in some vague, romantic sense, but everything with all the weight and implication that word carried. His control and my surrender. His authority and my willingness to submit to it. The way he looked at me like I was something he wanted to possess, and the terrifying realization that part of me wanted to be possessed by him. I didn't answer immediately. Couldn't answer because the question felt too large, too loaded with consequences I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Instead, I stood up from my desk, closed the distance between us by half, and tried to find my voice. The silence stretched between us like a hell breath. I could see him processing my non-response, could watch him retreat slightly back into that professional distance he wore like armor. But I didn't leave, and somehow that seemed to be answer enough. Later, after we had both returned to the pretense of work, after I'd spent another hour staring at my screen without really seeing it, he appeared beside my desk again. This time, when I looked up, he was holding his jacket, clearly preparing to leave for the night. "I'll walk you to the elevator," he said, and there was nothing particularly unusual about the offer except for the way he said it, like it was both a courtesy and something more significant. We walked through the empty office together, past the darkened cubicles and conference rooms, our footsteps muffled by the carpet. When we reached the bank of elevators, he pressed the call button, and we waited in that particular kind of silence that comes when two people are standing closer than they need to be. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, expecting him to follow. Instead, he remained in the hallway, one hand holding the door open, and there was something in his expression that made my pulse quicken. Without warning, he stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and pressed his hand against my chest. Not pushing, not restraining, just resting there over my heart like he was feeling for something. His palm was warm through my shirt, and I could feel my heartbeat accelerating under his touch, could see from his expression that he felt it too. "See?" he murmured, his voice so low I almost didn't catch the words. "You already did stay." The elevator door tried to close, bumped against his arm, and slid open again with a mechanical complaint. But neither of us moved. His hand remained pressed against my chest, and I found myself leaning slightly into the contact, drawn by the heat of his skin and the weight of his gaze. The words echoed in my head like a truth I had been running from for weeks. Because he was right. I had stayed. Not just tonight, but every night for months now. I had been staying long after my work was done, long after any reasonable professional obligation, staying because being near him felt like standing next to a fire on a cold day. Dangerous and necessary at the same time. His thumb moved slightly against my shirt, a barely perceptible caress that sent electricity racing through my entire nervous system. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me right there in the elevator, might finally close the distance that had been tormenting both of us for so long. Instead, he stepped back, let the door begin to close, and said my name so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the mechanical whir of the elevator machinery. Nathaniel. Just my name, but the way he said it felt like a promise and a warning rolled into one. Like he was claiming something, or maybe just acknowledging something that had already been claimed weeks ago in all those late-night moments when the office felt like it belonged only to us. The elevator doors closed, carrying me down toward the lobby and the street and the cold October night. But his words stayed with me, echoing in the enclosed space like a truth I could no longer deny. I had stayed. I was still staying. And despite every rational thought telling me this was dangerous, that mixing personal desire with professional obligation was a recipe for disaster, I knew I wasn't going to stop staying anytime soon. The weekend that followed felt endless. I moved through Saturday and Sunday like someone walking through fog, unable to focus on anything except the memory of his hand pressed against my chest, the weight of his words echoing in my head. "You already did stay." By Monday morning, I had convinced myself that I needed to end this, whatever this was, before it consumed what was left of my professional judgment. I arrived at the office early, determined to maintain appropriate distance, to treat Dorian like nothing more than my supervisor. But when he walked past my desk at 9:15 with his usual coffee, when he nodded at me with that same careful professionalism, I felt something crack inside my chest. The pretense suddenly felt unbearable. For 3 days, I tried to go back to the way things were before. I completed my assignments, attended meetings, and left the office at reasonable hours like a normal person with a normal job. I told myself this was the smart choice, the mature response to a situation that had gotten too complicated for its own good. But by Wednesday night, sitting in my small apartment with takeout I couldn't taste and a television show I wasn't watching, I realized I was miserable. Not just disappointed or frustrated, but genuinely, deeply miserable in a way that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with the man I had been avoiding for 3 days. Thursday morning, I was back to staying late. Dorian noticed, of course. I could see it in the way he glanced at my desk when he thought I wasn't looking, could feel his attention like a weight pressing against my shoulders. But neither of us spoke about it. We maintained our professional distance during the day, exchanged the appropriate pleasantries, conducted business with the same efficiency we always had. It was almost midnight when I finally reached my breaking point. I had been staring at the same spreadsheet for 2 hours, pretending to work while actually just existing in the same space as him, when I realized how pathetic the entire situation had become. I was 23 years old, sitting in an empty office in the middle of the night, pining for my boss like some kind of tragic character in a novel I would have been embarrassed to read. I saved my work, stood up from my desk, and walked directly to his office. He looked up when I appeared in his doorway, and there was something almost relieved in his expression, like he had been waiting for this moment as much as I had been dreading it. "I can't keep being your project," I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. "I need to know if this is real." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush us both. Dorian leaned back in his chair, studying my face with that same intensity he brought to complex financial problems, like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, almost vulnerable. "It's real," he said, "but real costs something." For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain. Not the composed, untouchable executive everyone else saw, but someone who was as lost in this as I was. Someone who understood that acknowledging what existed between us would change everything, and wasn't sure either of us was prepared for the consequences. I took a step closer to his desk, then another, until I was standing directly in front of him with nothing but a few feet of space and months of careful pretense between us. "Then let cost," I said. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a surrender, like the most honest thing either of us had said since this whole complicated dance began. Dorian stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact, and I could see him making some kind of internal decision. The professional mask he wore so carefully was slipping, revealing something raw and hungry underneath, something that made my pulse quicken and my breathing go shallow. The office around us was completely silent. No hum of computers, no distant voices, no mechanical sound from the building systems. Just us, standing in a pool of lamplight, surrounded by the weight of everything we had been not saying for months. He moved around the desk with deliberate slowness, like he was giving me time to change my mind, to step back, to retreat into the safety of professional distance. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. I stood there, watching him approach, feeling like every nerve ending in my body was suddenly hyper-aware of his presence. When he was close enough to touch, close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes and smell his cologne, he stopped. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I could see my own want reflected in his dark eyes, could feel the tension that had been building between us for weeks finally reaching its breaking point. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, until I thought one of us might shatter from the weight of it. Then Dorian reached up, cupped my face in his hands, and finally closed the distance between us. His mouth was warm and demanding against mine. Nothing tentative or questioning about the way he kissed me. This was deliberate, claiming, undeniable. His hands were firm against my face, holding me exactly where he wanted me, and I found myself leaning into the contact, into the heat of his body, into the reality of something I had been imagining for so long it had started to feel like fantasy. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing harder than we should have been, he rested his forehead against mine and spoke in a voice so low I almost didn't catch the words. "No more pretending," he said. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and felt something that had been tightly coiled in my chest finally begin to unwind. No smirk this time. No test. No carefully constructed professional distance. Just truth, finally spoken in the fluorescent-lit silence of an empty office, with the taste of him still on my lips and the weight of his hands still warm against my skin. 3 months later, the office still hums with the same familiar rhythm it always has. Files stacked in neat piles on desks, coffee cups scattered across conference tables, the persistent click of keyboards and murmur of phone conversations that fill the daylight hours. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing has changed. The same fluorescent lights cast their pale glow over the same workstations. The same people arrive at the same times and leave with the same casual complaints about traffic or weather or weekend plans. Marcus from accounting still prefers the quiet office to his chaotic house, staying late to work on reports that could wait until morning. Jennifer from marketing still gets consumed by campaigns that keep her here past reasonable hours. The coffee machine still makes the particular grinding sound that everyone has learned to ignore, and the elevators still arrive with the same soft chime they always have. But I know the difference. It lives in the spaces between words, in glances that last a fraction of a second longer than they should, in the way Dorian's voice carries just the slightest change in tone when he speaks to me during meetings. Professional still, always professional, but underneath there's something that belongs only to us. A shared language that developed in those late-night hours when the building felt like it existed outside of time. During the day, we maintain the same careful boundaries we always have. He assigns me projects with his usual crisp efficiency, critiques my work with the same surgical precision that made him legendary in this office long before I arrived. I respond with appropriate professionalism, asking the right questions, meeting deadlines, conducting myself like any other junior analyst who takes his job seriously. But there are moments, small ones, almost imperceptible to anyone who isn't looking for them. The way his fingers linger just slightly when he hands me documents. How he pauses in my periphery when I'm working on something complex, not hovering exactly, but present in a way that feels protective. The careful way he avoids my eyes during team presentations, as if direct contact might give something away that we're not ready to share with the fluorescent-lit corporate world that pays our salaries. Our colleagues see nothing unusual. Why would they? Dorian Hayes has always been demanding, has always expected excellence, has always maintained appropriate professional distance from his subordinates. And I have always been the eager junior analyst, staying late, working hard, proving that hiring me wasn't a mistake. The only difference is in what happens when the office empties. Tonight is like dozens of others over the past few months. The familiar evening migration toward elevators and parking garages, conversations about dinner plans and television shows fading as the workspace gradually empties. I sit at my desk, ostensibly finishing a client analysis, but really just existing in that suspended moment when day transitions to something else entirely. By 9 o'clock, it's just us again. I can hear him moving around in his office, the soft sounds that have become as familiar as my own heartbeat. Papers shuffling, keyboard clicking, the quiet scrape of his chair against the floor. Normal sounds that somehow feel loaded with anticipation now, like a symphony building towards something inevitable. At 9:30, his office light dims slightly. At 9:45, I hear the distinctive sound of his laptop closing. These are the small rituals that have developed between us, the subtle signals that mark the transition from professional obligation to something more personal. When he appears in his doorway, jacket draped over his arm, tie loosened just enough to suggest the end of official business, I'm already saving my work. The pretense of spreadsheets and quarterly reports has become just that, pretense, though we both maintain it with the dedication of actors who have perfected their roles. Ready to call it a night? He asks, and his voice carries that familiar undertone that makes my pulse quicken despite months of hearing it. I nod, gathering my things with movements that feel more like choreography than actual preparation to leave. We've done this dance so many times now that every gesture feels deliberate, weighted with the knowledge of what comes next. We walk through the empty office together, past darkened cubicles and conference rooms, our footsteps muffled by carpet that has absorbed thousands of similar journeys. But tonight, instead of stopping at the elevators, instead of that careful moment of separation that sends us to different floors and different lives, he turns toward his office. The door closes behind us with a soft click that somehow sounds definitive in the silence. Final, like the end of something and the beginning of something else all at once. The office that has been the setting for so many careful professional interactions transforms in the lamplight, becomes intimate instead of corporate, warm instead of sterile. The same desk where he's criticized my reports and assigned me projects now feels like sacred ground, witness to the months of careful pretense that led us here. When he turns to face me, there's none of the uncertainty that marked those early weeks. No testing, no games, no careful measurement of boundaries and consequences. Just the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly what he wants and has finally allowed himself to claim it. This time, no words are needed. No invitations or challenges or loaded silences that stretch until one of us breaks. We've moved beyond language into something more fundamental, more honest than anything we could say out loud. The slam coffee cup that started all of this feels like it happened in another lifetime, to different people who were still pretending they didn't want what was right in front of them. What remains is simpler and more complex at the same time. The choice we made to stop pretending the after hours weren't ours all along. When he reaches for me in the lamplight, when I step into the space between his hands like I was always meant to be there, the fluorescent-lit corporate world outside his office door feels impossibly far away, like it belongs to other people leading other lives, people who have never felt the particular electricity that comes from surrendering to something you've been fighting for months. The office building settles around us with small mechanical sighs, the heating system cycling on, elevators moving between floors for the cleaning crews who work while the rest of the city sleeps. But inside this room, time feels suspended, measured not in minutes or hours, but in heartbeats and the quiet sounds of two people who have finally stopped running for what they want. Tomorrow there will be meetings and deadlines and all the mundane obligations that fill our days. There will be professional distance and appropriate boundaries and the careful performance of corporate hierarchy that keeps the world spinning on its axis. But tonight, in the warm circle of lamplight that makes everything beyond these walls feel like a distant dream, we belong entirely to each other. And for the first time since that night, when everything changed, that feels like enough.